5. A short dictionary of misunderstood words continued. Parades. People in Italy or France have it easy. When their parents force them to go to church, they get back at them by joining the party. Communist, Maoist, Trotskyist, etc. Sabina, however, was the first to set church by her father, then forced him to attend meetings of the Communist Youth League. He was afraid of what would happen if she stayed away. When she marched in the obligatory May Day parades, she could never keep in step, and the girl behind her would shout at her and purposely tread on her heels. When the time came to sing, she never knew the words of the songs and would neither open and close her mouth, but the other girls would notice and report her. From her youth on, she hated parades. Franz studied in Paris, and because he was extraordinarily gifted in his scholarly career, was assured from the time he was 20. At 20, he knew that he would live out his life within the confines of his university office, 1 or 2 libraries, and 2 or 3 lecture halls. The idea of such a life made him feel suffocated. He yearned to step out of his life the way one steps out of a house into the street, and so long as he lived in Paris, he took part in every possible demonstration. How nice it was to celebrate something, demand something, protest against something, to be out in the open, and to be with others. The parades flying down the Boulevard Saint-Germain of the Place de la République to the Bastille fascinated him. He saw the marching, shouting crowd as the image of Europe and its history. Europe was the grand march, the march from revolution to revolution, from struggle to struggle, ever onward. I might put it another way. Franz felt his book life to be unreal. He yearned for real life, for the touch of people walking side by side with him, for their shouts. It never occurred to him that what he considered unreal, the work he did in the solitude of the office or library, was in fact his real life, whereas the parades he imagined to be reality were nothing but theater, dance, carnival, in other words, a dream. During her studies, Sabina lived in a dormitory. On May Day, all students had to report early in the morning for parade. Student officials would comb the building to ensure that no one was missing. Sabina hid in the lavatory. Not until long after the building was empty would she go back to her room. It was quieter than anywhere she could remember. The only sound was the parade music echoing in the distance. It was as though she had found refuge inside a shell, and the only sound she could hear was the sea of an inimical world. A year or 2 after immigrating, she happened to be in Paris on the anniversary of the Russian invasion of her country. A protest march had been scheduled. She felt driven to the part. Fists raised high, the young Frenchman shouted out slogans condemning Soviet imperialism. She liked the slogans, but to her surprise she found herself unable to shout along with them. She lasted no more than a few minutes in the parade. When she told her French friends about it, they were amazed. "You mean you don't want to fight in the occupation of your country?" She would have liked to tell them that behind communism, fascism, behind all occupations and invasions lurks a no more basic, pervasive evil, that the image of that evil is a parade of people marching by with raised fists and shouting identical syllables in unison. But she knew she would never be able to make them understand. Embarrassed, she changed the subject. Beauty of New York. Franz and Sabina would walk the streets of New York for hours at a time. The view changed with each step as if they were following a winding mountain path, surrounded by breathtaking scenery. A young man kneeling in the middle of the sidewalk praying. A few steps away, a beautiful black woman leaning against a tree, a man in a black suit directing an invisible orchestra while crossing the street, a fountain spurting water, and a group of construction workers sitting on the rim eating lunch, strange iron ladders running up and down buildings with ugly red facades, so ugly that they were beautiful. Next door, a huge glass skyscraper, backed by another, itself toppled by a small Arabic pleasantdom, with turrets, galleries, and gilded columns. She was reminded of her paintings. There, too, incongruous things came together. A steelworks construction site superimposed on a kerosene lamp, an old-fashioned lamp with a painted glass shade, shattered to tiny splinters, rising up over a desolate landscape of marshland. Franz said, "Beauty in the European sense has always had a premeditated quality to it. We've always had an aesthetic intention and a long-range plan. That's what enabled Western men to spend decades building a Gothic cathedral or Renaissance piazza. The beauty of New York rests on a completely different base. It's unintentional. It arose independent of human design like a stalagmitic cavern. Forms which are in themselves quite ugly turn up fortuitously without design in such incredible surroundings that they sparkle with a sudden wondrous poetry." Sabina said, "Unintentional beauty. Yes, that's another way of putting it. It might be beauty by mistake. Before beauty disappears entirely from the earth, it will go on existing for a while by mistake. Beauty by mistake, the final phase in the history of beauty." And she recalled her first mature painting, which had came into being because some red paint had dripped on it by mistake. Yes, her paintings were based on beauty by mistake. And New York was the secret but authentic homeland of her painting. Franz said, "Perhaps New York's unintentional beauty is much richer and more varied than the excessively strict and composed beauty of human design, but it's not our European beauty, it's an alien world." Didn't they then at least agree on something? No, there is a difference. Sabina very much attracted attracted by the alien quality of New York's beauty. Franz found it intriguing but frightening. It made him feel homesick for Europe. Sabina's country. Sabina understood Franz's distaste for America. He was the embodiment of Europe. His mother was Viennese, his father French, he himself was Swiss. Franz greatly admired Sabina's country. Whenever she told him about herself and friends at home, Franz heard the words prison, persecution, enemy, tanks, immigration, pamphlets, banned books, banned exhibitions. He felt a curious mixture of envy and nostalgia. He made a confession to Sabina. A philosopher once wrote that everything in my work is unverifiable speculation, and called me Pseudo-Socrates. I felt terribly humiliated and made a furious response. And just think, that laughable episode was the greatest conflict I've ever experienced, the pinnacle of the dramatic possibilities available to my life. We live in two different dimensions, you and I. You came into my life like Gulliver, entering the land of the Lilliputians. Sabina protested. She said that conflict, drama, and tragedy didn't mean a thing. There was nothing inherently valuable in them, nothing deserving of respect or admiration. What was truly enviable was Franz's work and the fact that he had a peace and quiet to devote himself to it. Franz shook his head. With a society as rich, people don't need to work with their hands. They can devote themselves to activities of the spirit. We have more and more universities and more students. If students are going to earn degrees, they've got to come up with dissertation topics. And since dissertations can be written about everything under the sun, the number of topics is infinite. Sheets of paper covered, the words pile up in archives sadder than cemeteries because no one ever visits them, not even All Souls Day. Culture is perishing in overproduction and an avalanche of words and the madness of quantity. That's why one banned book in your former country means infinitely more than the billions of words spewed out by our universities. It is in this spirit that we may understand Franz's weakness for revolution. First he sympathized with Cuba, then with China, and then when the cruelty of their regimes began to appall him, he resigned himself with a sight of sea words with no weight and no resemblance to life. He became professor in Geneva, where there were no demonstrations and a burst of abnegation and a womanless, paradeless solitude. He published several scholarly books, all of which received considerable acclaim. Then one day along came Sabina. She was a revelation. She came from a land where a revolutionary illusion had long since faded, but where the thing that he admired most in revolution remained, life on a large scale, a life of risk, daring, and the danger of death. Sabina had renewed his faith in the grandeur of human endeavor, superimposing the painful drama of her country on her person. He found her even more beautiful. The trouble was that Sabina had no love for that drama. The words prison, persecution, banned books, occupation, tanks were ugly, without the slightest trace of romance. The only word that evoked her in a sweet nostalgic memory of her homeland was the word cemetery. Cemeteries in Bohemia are like gardens. The graves are covered with grass and colorful flowers. Modest tombstones are lost in the greenery. When the sun goes down, the cemetery sparkles with tiny candles. It looks as though the dead were dancing at a children's ball. Yes, a children's ball, because the dead are as innocent as children. No matter how brutal the life becomes, peace always reigns in the cemetery, even in wartime, in his Hitler's time and Stalin's time. Through all occupations, when she felt low, she would get into the car, leave Prague behind, and walk through one another of the country cemeteries she loved so well. Against a backdrop of blue hills, they were as beautiful as a lullaby. For Franz, a cemetery was an ugly dump of stones and bones. 6. I'd never drive. I'm scared stiff of accidents. Even if they don't kill you, they mark you for life. And so saying, the sculptor made an instinctive grab for the finger he had nearly chopped off one day while whittling away at Buddha's statue. It was a miracle the finger had been saved. What do you mean? Said Marie-Claude in a raucous voice. She was on top form. I was in a serious accident once, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world. And I've never had more fun than I was in that hospital. I couldn't sleep a wink, so I just read and read day and night. They all looked at her in amazement. She basked in it. Franz reacted with a mixture of disgust. He knew then, after the accident in question, his wife had fallen into a deep depression, and complained incessantly in admiration. Her ability to transform everything she experienced was a sign of true vitality. I was there. I began to divide books into day books and night books, she went on. Really, there are books meant for daytime reading and books that can be only read at night. Now they all looked at her in amazement and admiration. All that is, but the sculptor, who was still holding his finger and wrinkling his face at the memory of the accident. Marie-Claude turned to him and asked, "Which category would you put Stendhal in?" The sculptor had not heard the question and shrugged his shoulders uncomfortably. An art critic standing next to him said he thought Stendhal is daytime reading. Marie-Claude shook her head and said in her raucous voice, No, you're wrong. Stendhal is night author. Franz's participation in the debate on night and day art was disturbed by the fact that he was expecting Sabina to show up at any minute. They had spent many days pondering whether or not she should accept the invitation to this cocktail party. It was a party Marie-Claude was giving for all painters and sculptors who had ever exhibited in their private gallery. Ever since Sabina had met Franz, she had avoided his wife, but because they feared being found out, they came to the conclusion that it would be more natural and therefore less suspicious for her to come. While throwing unobtrusive looks in the direction of the entrance hall, Franz heard his 18-year-old daughter, Marie-Anne, holding forth from the other end of the room. Excusing himself from the group presided over by his wife, he made his way up to the group presided over by his daughter. Some were in chairs, others standing, but Marie-Anne was cross-legged on the floor. Franz was certain that Marie-Claude would soon switch to the carpet on her side of the room, too. Sitting on the floor when you had guests was at the time was a gesture simplifying simplicity. Informality, liberal politics, hospitality, and a Parisian way of life. The passion with which Marie-Claude sat on all fours was such that Franz began worrying that she would take sitting on the floor as a shop where she brought her cigarettes. "What are you working on now, Elaine?" Marie-Anne asked the man whose at feet she was sitting. Elaine was so naive and sincere as to give the gallery owner's daughter an honest answer. He started explaining his new approach to her, a combination of photography and oil, but he had scarcely got through the sentences when Marie-Anne began whistling a tune. The painter was speaking slowly and with great concentration, did not hear the whistling. "Will you tell me why you're whistling?" Franz whispered. "Because I don't like to hear people talk about politics," she answered out loud. And in fact, two men standing in the same circle were discussing the coming elections in France. Marie-Anne, who felt it her duty to direct the proceedings, asked the men whether they were planning to go to the Rossini Opera an Italian company was putting on in Geneva the following week. Meanwhile, Elaine, the painter, sank into greater and greater detail about his new approach to painting. Franz was ashamed for his daughter. To put her in her place, he announced that whenever she went to the opera, she complained terribly of boredom. "You're awful," said Marie-Anne, trying to punch him in the stomach from a sitting position. "The star tenor is so handsome, so handsome. I've seen him twice now, and I'm in love with him." Franz could not get over how much like her mother his daughter was. Why shouldn't she be like him? But there was nothing he could do about it. She was not like him. How many times he had heard Marie-Claude proclaim she was in love with this or that painter, singer, writer, politician, and once even with a racing cyclist. Of course, it was all mere cocktail party rhetoric. But he could not help recalling how now and then, more than 20 years ago, she had gone about saying the same thing about him and threatening him with suicide to boot. At that point, Sabina entered the room. Marie-Claude walked up to her. While Marie-Anne went on about Rossini, Franz trained his attention on the two women were saying. After a few friendly words of greeting, Marie-Claude lifted the ceramic pendant from Sabina's neck and said in a very loud voice, "What is that? How ugly!" Those words made a deep impression on Franz. They were not meant to be combative. The raucous laughter immediately following them made it clear that by rejecting the pendant, Marie-Claude did not wish to jeopardize their friendship with Sabina, but it was not the kind of thing she usually said. "I made it myself," said Sabina. "That pendant is ugly, really," Marie-Claude repeated very loudly. "You shouldn't wear it." Franz knew his wife didn't care whether the pendant was ugly or not. An object was ugly if she willed it ugly, beautiful if she willed it beautiful. Pendants worn by her friends were a priori beautiful, and even if she did find them ugly, she would never say so, because flattery had long since become the second nature to her. Why, then, did she decide that the pendant Sabina had made herself was ugly? Franz suddenly saw the answer plainly. Marie-Claude proclaimed Sabina's pendant ugly because she could afford to do so. Or to be more precise, Marie-Claude proclaimed Sabina's pendant ugly to make it clear that she could afford to tell Sabina her pendant was ugly. Sabina's exhibition the year before had not been particularly successful, so Marie-Claude did not set great store by Sabina's favor. Sabina, however, had every reason to set store by Marie-Claude's. Yet that was not at all evident from her behavior. Yes, Franz saw it plainly. Marie-Claude had taken advantage of the occasion to make clear to Sabina and others what real balance of power was between the two of them. 7. A short dictionary of words. Misunderstood words concluded. The old church in Amsterdam. There are houses running along one side of the street, and behind the large ground floor front windows, all the whores have little rooms and plushy pillowed armchairs in which they sit up close to the glass. Wearing bras and panties, they look like big bored cats. On the other side of the street is a gigantic Gothic cathedral, dating from the 14th century. Between the whore's world and God's world, like a river dividing two empires, stretches an intense smell of urine. Inside the old church, all that is left of the Gothic style is the high, bare, white walls, the columns, the vaulting, the windows. There is not a single image on the walls, not a single piece of statuary anywhere. The church is as empty as a gymnasium, except for the very center, where several rows of chairs have been arranged in a large square around a miniature podium for the minister. Behind the chairs are wooden booths, stalls for wealthy burghers. The chairs and stalls seem to have been placed there without the slightest concern for the shape of the walls or the position of the columns, as if wishing to express their indifference to disdain or Gothic architecture. Centuries ago, Calvinist faith turned the cathedral into a hangar, its only function being to keep the prayers of the faithful safe from rain and snow. Franz was fascinated by the grand march of the history had passed through this gigantic hall. Sabina recalled how the communist coup, with all the castles in Bohemia, were nationalized and turned into manual training centers, retirement homes, and also cowsheds. She had visited one of the cowsheds. Hooks for iron rings had been hammered into the stucco walls, the cows tied to the rings gazed dreamily out of the windows of the castle grounds and now overrun with chickens. "It's the emptiness of it that fascinates me," said Franz. "People collect altars, statues, paintings, chairs, carpets, and books, and then becomes a time of joyful relief, and they throw it all out, like so much refuse from yesterday's dinner table. Can't you just picture Hercules' broom sweeping out to this cathedral The poor had to stand while the rich had stalls, said Sabina, pointing to them. But there was something that bound the bankers and the beggars, a hatred of beauty. What is beauty? Said Franz, and he saw himself attending to a recent gallery preview at his wife's side, and at her insistence. The endless vanity of speeches and words, the vanity of culture, the vanity of art. When Sabina was working in the student brigade, her soul poisoned by the cheerful marshes issuing incessantly from the loudspeakers, she borrowed a motorcycle one Sunday and headed for the hills. She stopped at a tiny remote village she had never seen before, leaned the motorcycle against the church and went in. A mass happened to be in progress. Religion was persecuted by the regime, and most people gave the church a wide berth. The only people in the pews were old men and women. Because they did not fear the regime, they only feared death. The priest intoned words with a sing-song voice, and the people repeated them after him in unison. It was a litany. The same words kept coming back, like a wanderer who cannot tear his eyes away from the countryside, or like a man who cannot take leave of his life. She sat in one of the last pews, closing her eyes to hear the music of the words, opening them to stare up at the blue vault, dotted with large gold stars. She was entranced. She had expectedly met there in the village church was not God, it was beauty. She knew perfectly well that neither the church nor the litany was beautiful in and of itself, but they were beautiful compared to the construction site where she spent her days amid the racket of the songs. The Mass was beautiful because it appeared to her in a sudden mysterious revelation as a world betrayed. From that time on she knew that beauty is a world betrayed. The only way we can encounter it is if its persecutors have overlooked it somewhere. Beauty hides behind the scenes of the May Day parade. If we want to find it, we must demolish the scenery. This is the first time I've ever been fascinated by the church, said Franz. It was neither Protestantism or asceticism that made him so enthusiastic. It was something else, something highly personal, something he did not dare discuss with Sabina. He thought he heard a voice telling him to seize Hercules' broom and sweep all of Marie Claude's previews, all of Marie Anne's singers, all lectures and symposia, all useless speeches and vain words, sweep them out of his life. The great empty space of Amsterdam's old church had appeared to him in a sudden and mysterious revelation as the image of his own liberation strength. Stroking Franz's arm in bed one night, at the many hotels where they made love, Sabina said, "The muscles you have, they're unbelievable." Franz took pleasure in her praise. He climbed out of bed, got down on his haunches, grabbed at a heavy oak chair by one head, lifted it slowly into the air. "You never have to be afraid," he said. "I can protect you no matter what. I used to be a judo champion." When he raised a hand over with the heavy chair above his head, Sabina said, "It's good to know you're so strong." But deep down she said to herself, Franz may be strong, but his strength is directed outward. When it comes to the people he lives with, the people he loves, he's weak. Franz's weakness is called goodness. Franz would never give Sabina orders. He would never command her, as Tomas did, to lay the mirror on the floor and walk back and forth on it naked. Not that he lacks sensuality, he simply lacks the strength to give orders. There are things that can be accomplished only by violence. Physical love is unthinkable without violence. Sabina watched Franz walk across the room with a chair above his head, and the scene struck her as grotesque and filled her with an odd sadness. Franz set the chair down on the floor opposite Sabina and sat in it. "I really enjoy being strong, of course," he said, "but I do these muscles do me in Geneva. They're like an ornament, a peacock feather. I've never fought anyone in my life." Sabina proceeded with her melancholy musings. What if she had a man who ordered her about, a man who wanted to master her? How long should she put up with him? Not 5 minutes. From which it follows that no man was right for her, strong or weak. "Why don't you ever use your strength on me?" she said. "Because love means renouncing strength," said Franz, softly. Sabina realized 2 things. First, that Franz's words were noble and just. Second, that they disqualified him from her love life, living in truth. Such is the formula set forth by Kakwa somewhere in the diaries or letters. Franz couldn't quite remember where, but it captivated him. What does it mean to live in truth? Putting it negatively is easy enough. It means not lying, not hiding, and not dissimulating. And from the time he met Sabina, however, Franz had been living in lies. He told his wife about non-existent congresses in Amsterdam, lectures in Madrid. He was afraid to walk with Sabina in the streets of Geneva, and he enjoyed the lying and hiding, and it was also new to him. He was as excited as a teacher's pet who has plucked up the courage to play truant. For Sabina, living in truth, lying neither to ourselves nor to others was possible only away from the public. The moment someone keeps an eye on what we do, we involuntarily make allowances for that eye, and nothing we do is truthful. Keeping a public in mind, means living in lies. Sabina despised literature in which people give away all kinds of intimate secrets about themselves and their friends. A man who loses his privacy loses everything, Sabina thought, and a man who gives it up of his own free will is a monster. That was why Sabina did not suffer in the least from having to keep her love secret. On the contrary, only by doing so could she live in truth. Franz, on the other hand, was certain that the division of life into private and public spheres was the source of all lies. A person is one thing in private and something quite different in public. For Franz, living in truth meant breaking down the barriers between private and public. He was fond of quoting André Breton on the desirability of living in a glass house into which everyone could look and there are no secrets. When he heard his wife telling Sabina that Pindit is ugly, he knew he could no longer live in lies and had to stand up for Sabina. He had not done so only because he was afraid of betraying their secret love. The day after the cocktail party, he was supposed to go to Rome with Sabina for the weekend. He could not get that Pindit is ugly out of his mind. It made him see Marie Claude as a completely new light. Her aggressiveness, invulnerable, noisy, full of vitality, relieved him of the burden of goodness she had personally borne all 23 years of their marriage. He recalled the enormous inner space of the old church in Amsterdam and felt this strange, incomprehensible ecstasy that void had evoked in him. He was packing his overnight bag when Marie Claude came into the room, chatting about the guests of the party, energetically endorsing the views of some and laughing off the views of others. Franz looked at her for a long time and said, "There isn't any conference in Rome." She did not see the point. "Then why are you going?" "I've had a mistress for 9 months," he said. "I don't want to meet her in Geneva. That's why I've been traveling so much. I thought it was time you knew about it." After the first few words he lost his nerve. He turned away so as not to see the despair on Marie Claude's face, the despair he expected the words to produce. After a short pause he heard her say, "Yes, I think it's time I knew about it." Her voice was so firm that Franz turned in her direction. She did not look at all disturbed. In fact, she looked like the very same woman who had said the day before, in a raucous voice, "The pendant is ugly," she continued. "Now that you've plucked up the courage to tell me you've been deceiving me for 9 months, do you think you can tell me who she is?" He had always told himself he had no right to hurt Marie Claude, and she should respect the woman in her. But where had the woman in her gone? In other words, what had happened to the mother image he mentally linked with his wife? His mother, sad and wounded, his mother, wearing unmatched shoes, had departed from Marie Claude, or perhaps not, because she had never been inside Marie Claude at all. The whole thing came to him in a flash of hatred. "I have no reason to hide it from you," he said. If he had not succeeded in wounding her with his infidelity, he was certain the revelation of her rival would do the trick. Looking her straight in the eye, he told her about Sabina. A while later he met Sabina at the airport. As the plane gained altitude, he felt lighter and lighter. At last he said to himself, after 9 months he was living in truth. 8. Sabina felt as though Franz had pried open the door of their privacy, as though she were peering into the heads of Marie Claude and Marie Anna, Elaine the painter and the sculptor who held on to his finger. Of all the people she knew in Geneva, now she would willy-nilly become the rival woman who did not interest her in the least. Franz would ask for a divorce. She would likely take Marie Claude's place in his large conjugal bed. Everyone would follow the process from a greater or lesser distance, and she would be forced to play act before them all. Instead of being Sabina, she would have to act the role of Sabina, decide how best to act the role. Once her love had been publicized, it would gain weight to become a burden. Sabina cringed at the very thought of it. They had supper at a restaurant in Rome. She drank her wine in silence. "You're not angry, are you?" Franz asked. She assured him she was not. She was still confused and unsure whether to be happy or not. She recalled the time they met in the sleeping compartment of the Amsterdam Express, the time she wanted to go down on her knees before him and beg him to hold her, squeeze her, never let her go. She had longed to come to the end of the dangerous road of betrayal. She had longed to call a halt to it all. Try as she might to intensify that longing, summon it to her head, lean on it, the feeling of distaste only grew stronger. They walked back to the hotel through the streets of Rome. Because the Italians around them were making a racket, shouting and gesticulating, they could walk along in silence without hearing their silence. Sabina spent a long time washing in the bathroom. Franz waited for her under the blanket. As always, the small lamp was lit. When she came out, she turned it off. It was the very first time she had done so. Franz would have paid better attention. He did not notice it because the light did not mean anything to him. As we know, he made love with his eyes shut. In fact, it was his closed eyes that made Sabina turn out the light. She could not stand those lowered eyelids a moment longer. The eyes, as the saying goes, are windows to the soul. Franz's body, which thrashed about on top of her closed eyes, and therefore a body without a soul. It was like a newborn animal, still blind and whimpering for the drug. Muscular Franz in coitus was like a gigantic puppy suckling at her breasts. He actually had her nipple in his mouth as if it were a sucking lick. The idea was a mature man below and a suckling infant above, and she was therefore having intercourse with a baby bordered on the disgusting. No, she would never again see his body moving desperately over hers, never again offer him her breast bitch to whelp. Today was the last time, irrevocably the last time. She knew, of course, that she was being supremely unfair, that Franz was the best man she had ever had. He was intelligent. He understood her paintings. He was handsome and good. But the more she thought about it, the more she longed to ravish his intelligence, defile his kind-heartedness, and violate his powerless strength. That night she made love to him with greater frenzy than ever before. Aroused by the realization that this was the last time making love, she was far, far away. Once more she heard the golden horde of betrayal beckoning her in the distance, and she knew she would not hold out. She sensed an expanse of freedom before her, and the boundlessness of it excited her. She made mad, unrestrained love to Franz as she never had before. Franz sobbed as he lay on top of her. He was certain he understood. Sabina had been quiet all through dinner and said not a word about his decision, but this was her answer. She had made a clear show of her joy, her passion, her consent, her desire to live with him forever. He felt like a rider galloping off into the magnificent void, a void of no wife, no daughter, no household, a magnificent void swept clean by Hercules' broom, a magnificent void he could fill with his love. Each was riding the other like a horse, and both were galloping off into the distance of their desires, drunk on the betrayals that freed them. Franz was riding Sabina, had betrayed his wife. Sabina was riding Franz, and betrayed Franz. 9. For 20 years he had seen his mother, a poor, weak creature who needed his protection, and his wife. This image was deeply rooted in him, and he could not rid himself of it in 2 days. On the way home, his conscience began to bother him. He was afraid that Marie Claude had fallen apart after he left, and that he would find her terribly sick at heart. Stealthily, he unlocked the door and moved into his room. He stood there for a moment and listened. Yes, she was at home. After a moment's hesitation, he went to her room, ready to greet her as usual. "What?" she exclaimed, raising her eyebrows in mock surprise. "You here? Where else could I go?" he wanted to say, genuinely surprised, but said nothing. "Let's set the record straight, shall we? I have nothing against your moving in with her at once." When he made the confession on the day he left for Rome, he had no precise plan of action. He expected to come home and talk it all in a friendly atmosphere so as not to harm Marie Claude any more than necessary. It never occurred to him that she would calmly and coolly urge him to leave. Even though it facilitated things, he could not help feeling disappointed. He had been afraid of wounding her all his life and voluntarily stuck to a stultifying discipline of monogamy, and now after 20 years he suddenly learned that it had all been superfluous, and he had given up scores of women because of a misunderstanding. That afternoon he gave his lecture, then went straight to Sabina's from the university. He decided to ask whether he could spend the night. He rang the doorbell, but no one answered. He went and sat at the cafe across the street and stared long and hard at the entrance of her building. Evening came. He did not know where to turn. All his life he had shared his bed with Marie Claude. If he went home to Marie Claude, where should he sleep? He could, of course, make up a bed on the sofa next the room. But wouldn't that be merely an eccentric gesture? Wouldn't it look like a sign of ill will? He wanted to remain friends with her after all, yet getting into bed with her was out of the question. He could just hear her asking him ironically why he didn't prefer Sabina's bed. He took a room in a hotel. The next day he rang Sabina's doorbell, morning, noon, and night. The day after, he paid a visit to the concierge, who had no information and referred to him to the owner of the flat. He phoned her and found out that Sabina had given notice 2 days before. During the next few days, he returned at regular intervals, still hoping to find her in, but one day he found the door open, and 3 men in overalls loading the furniture and paintings into a van parked outside. He asked them where they were taking the furniture. They replied that they were under strict instructions not to reveal the address. He was about to offer them a few francs for the street address, when suddenly he felt he lacked the strength to do it. His grief had broken him utterly. He understood nothing, and no idea what had happened. All he knew was that he had been waiting for it to happen ever since he met Sabina. What must be, must be. Franz did not oppose it. He found a small flat for himself on the old part of the town. When he knew his wife and daughter were away, he went back to his former home to fetch his clothes and most essential books. He was careful to remove nothing that Marie Claude might miss. One day he saw her through the window of a cafe. She was sitting with two women, and her face, long riddled with wrinkles from her unbridled gift of grimaces, was in a state of animation. The women were listening closely and laughing continually. Franz could not get over the feeling that she was telling them about him. Surely she knew that Sabina had disappeared from Geneva at the very time Franz had decided to live with her. What a funny story it would make! He was not the least bit surprised at becoming a butt to his wife's friends. When he got home to his new flat, where every hour he could hear the bells of St. Pierre, he found the departing store had delivered his new desk. He promptly forgot about Marie Claude and her friends. He even forgot about Sabina for the time being. He sat down at his desk. He was glad to have picked it out himself. For 20 years he had lived among furniture of not his own choosing. Marie Claude had taken care of everything. At least he had ceased to be a little boy. For the first time in his life he was on his own. The next day he hired a carpenter to make a bookcase for him. He spent several days designing it and deciding where it should stand. And at some point he realized to his great surprise that he was not particularly unhappy. Sabina's physical presence was much less important than he had suspected. What was important was the golden footprint, the magic footprint she had left on his life that no one could ever remove. Just before disappearing from his horizon, she had slipped him Hercules' broom, and he had used it to sweep everything he despised out of his life. A sudden happiness, a feeling of bliss, the joy that came of freedom and a new life, these were the gifts that she had left him. Actually, he had always preferred the unreal to the real, just as he felt better at demonstrations, which, as I have pointed out, are all play acting and dreams, than in a lecture hall full of students. So he was happier with Sabina, the invisible goddess, than Sabina, who had accompanied him through the world, and whose love he constantly feared losing. By giving him the unexpected freedom of a man living on his own, she provided him with a halo of seductiveness. He became very attractive to women, and one of his students fell in love with him, and so within an amazingly short period of the backdrop of his life he had changed completely. Until recently he had lived in a large upper-middle-class flat, with a servant, a daughter, and a wife. Now he lived in a tiny flat in the old part of town, where almost every night he was joined by his young student mistress. He did not need to squire her through the world from hotel to hotel. He could make love to her in his own flat, in his own bed, with his own books and ashtray on the bedside table. She was a modest girl and not particularly pretty, but she admired Franz in the way that Franz had only recently admired Sabina. He did not find it unpleasant, and if he did perhaps feel that trading Sabina for a student with glasses was something out of a compound down, his innate goodness saw to it that he cared for her and lavished on her the paternal love that never had the true outlet before, given that Marie Anne always behaved like his daughter and then a copy of Marie Claude. One day, he paid a visit to his wife. He told her he would like to remarry. Mary Claude shook her head. "But a divorce won't make any difference to you. She won't lose a thing." "I'll give you all the property." "I don't care about property," she said. "Then what do you care about?" "Love," she said with a smile. "Love?" Franz asked in amazement. "Love is a battle," said Marie Claude, still smiling, "and I plan to go on fighting to the end." "Love is a battle?" said Franz. "Well, I don't feel like all the fighting," and he left. 10. After 4 years in Geneva, Sabina settled in Paris, but she could not escape her melancholy. If someone had asked her what had come over her, she would have been hard-pressed to find words for it. When we give an expression to the dramatic situation in our lives, we tend to use metaphors of heaviness. We say that something has become a great burden to us. We either bear the burden or fail to go down with it. We struggle with it, win or lose, and Sabina, what had come over her? Nothing. She had left a man because she felt like leaving him. She had persecuted her. Had he tried to take revenge on her? No. Her drama was a drama not of heaviness, but of lightness. What fell to her lot was not the burden, but the unbearable lightness of being. Until that time, her betrayals had filled her with the excitement and joy because they opened up new paths and new adventures of betrayal. But what if the paths came to an end? One could betray one's parents, husband, country, love. But when parents, husband, country, and love were gone, what was left to betray? Sabina felt emptiness all around her. What if that emptiness was the goal of all her betrayals? Naturally, she had not realized it until now. How could she have? The goals were pursued, always veiled. A girl who longs for marriage longs for something she knows nothing about. The boy who hankers after fame has no idea what fame is. The thing that gives our every move its meaning is always totally unknown to us. Sabina was unaware of the goal that lay behind her longing to betray the unbearable lightness of being. What was the goal? Her departure from Geneva brought her considerably closer to it. 3 years after moving to Paris, she received a letter from Prague. It was from Tomas's son. Somehow or other, he had found out about her and got hold of her address. Now that he was writing to her as his father's closest friend, he informed her of the deaths of Tomas and Teresa. For the past few years, they had been living in a village where Tomas was employed as a driver at a collective farm. From time to time, they would go to the next town and spend night in a cheap hotel. The road there was rough with some hills, and their pickup had crashed and hurled down a steep incline. Their bodies had been crushed to a pulp. The police determined later that the brakes were in a disastrous condition. She could not get over the news. The last link to her past had been broken. According to her old habit, she decided to calm herself by taking a walk in a cemetery. The Montparnasse cemetery was the closest. It was all tiny houses, miniature chapels over each grave. Sabina could not understand why the dead would want to have imitation places built over them. The cemetery was vanity transmogrified into stone. Instead of growing more sensible in death, the inhabitants of the cemetery were sillier than they had been in life. Their monuments were meant to display how important they were. There were no fathers, brothers, sons, grandmothers buried. There were only public figures in the borders of titles, degrees, and honors. Even the postal clerk celebrated his chosen profession, his social significance, his dignity. Walking along a row of graves, she noticed people gathering for a burial. The funeral director had an armful of flowers and was going to give each one to each mourner. He handed one to Sabina as well. She joined the group. They made a detour past many monuments before they came to the grave, free for the moment of the heavy gravestone. She leaned over the hole. It was extremely deep. She dropped into the flower. It sailed down to the coffin in graceful somersaults. In Bohemia, the graves were not so deep. In Paris, the graves were deeper, just as the buildings were taller. Her eye fell on the stone which lay next to the grave. It chilled her, and she hurried home. She thought about the stone all day. Why had it horrified her so? She had answered herself, when graves are covered with stones, the dead can no longer get out. But the dead can't get out anyway. What difference does it make whether they're covered with soil or stones? The difference is that if a grave is covered with a stone, it means we don't want the deceased to come back. The heavy stone tells the deceased, stay where you are. That made Sabina think about her father's grave. There was soil above his grave with flowers growing out of it and a maple tree reaching down into it, and the roots and flowers offered his corpse a path out of the grave. If her father had been covered with stone, she would never have been able to communicate with him after he died and hear his voice in the trees pardoning her. What was it like in the cemetery as Teresa and Tomas were buried? Once more she started thinking about them. From time to time they would drive over to the next town and spend the night in a cheap hotel. That passage in the letter had caught her eye. It meant they were happy, and again she pictured Tomas if he were one of their paintings. Don Juan in the foreground, a spacious stage set by the naive painter, and through a crack in the set, Tristan. He died as Tristan, not as Don Juan. Sabina's parents had died in the same week. Tomas and Teresa the same second. Suddenly she missed Franz terribly. When she told him about their cemetery walks, he gave a share of his disgust and called cemeteries bone and stone dumps. A gulf of misunderstanding had immediately opened between them. Not until that day at the Montparnasse cemetery did she see what he meant. She was sorry to have been so impatient with him. Perhaps if they stayed together longer, Sabina and Franz could have begun to understand the words they used. Gradually, timorously, their vocabularies could have become together, like bashful lovers, and the music of one would have become to undersect with the music of the other, but it was too late now. Yes, it was too late, and Sabina knew she would leave Paris, move on again, because she was to die here, then cover up with a stone, and the mind of woman whom places home the thought of end all flight is unbearable. 11. All of Franz's friends knew about Marie Claude. They all knew about the girl with the oversized glasses, but no one knew about Sabina. Franz was wrong when he thought his wife had told her friends about her. Sabina was a beautiful woman, and Marie Claude did not want people going out comparing their faces. Because Franz was so afraid of being found out, he had never asked any of Sabina's paintings or drawings, even a snapshot of her. As a result, she disappeared from his life without a trace. There was not a scrap of tangible evidence to show that she had spent a wonderful year of his life with her, which only increased his desire to remain faithful to her. Sometimes when they were alone in his flat together, the girl would lift her eyes from the book, throw him an inquiring glance, and say, "What are you thinking about?" Sitting in the armchair, staring at the ceiling. Franz always found some plausible response, but in fact he was thinking of Sabina. Whenever he published an article in Scholarly Journal, the girl was the first to read it and discuss it with him, but all he could think of was what Sabina would have said about it. Everything he did for Sabina the way Sabina would have liked to see it done. It was a perfectly innocent form of infidelity, and one eminently suited to Franz, who would never have done his bespectacled student mistress any harm. He nourished the cult of Sabina more as religion than love. Indeed, according to the theology of that religion, it was Sabina who sent him the girl. Between his earthly love and his unearthly love, therefore, there is a perfect peace, and if unearthly love must, for theological reasons, contain a strong dose of the inexplicable and incomprehensible, we have only to recall the dictionary of misunderstood words and the long lexicon of misunderstandings. His earthly love rested on the true understanding. The student mistress was much younger than Sabina, and the musical composition of her life had scarcely been outlined. She was grateful to Franz for the motifs he gave her to insert. Franz's grand march was now her creed as well. Music was now her Dionysian intoxication. They often went dancing together. They lived in truth, and nothing they did was secret. They sought out the company of friends, colleagues, students, and strangers, enjoyed sitting, drinking, chatting with them. They took frequent excursions to the Alps. Franz would bend over, the girl hopped onto his back, and off he ran through the meadows, declaiming at the top of his voice a long German poem to his mother had taught him as a child. The girl laughed with glee, admiring his legs, shoulders, and lungs as she clapped his neck. The only thing she could not quite fathom was the curious sympathy he had for the countries occupied by the Russian Empire. On the anniversary of the invasion, they attended a memorial meeting organized by a Czech group in Geneva. The room was nearly empty. The speaker had artificially waved gray hair. He rattled out a long speech that bored even the few enthusiasts who had come to hear it. His French was grammatically correct, but heavily accented. From time to time, to stress a point, he would raise his index finger as if threatening the audience. The girl with the glasses could barely suppress her yawns, while Franz smiled blissfully at her side. The longer he looked at the pleasing gray-haired man with the admirable index finger, the more he saw him as a secret messenger, an angelic intermediary between him and his goddess. He closed his eyes and dreamed. He closed his eyes as he had closed them on Sabina's body in 15 European hotels and one in America.